problem is, they're 3,000 miles away. The colonists have very little say, if any, about if they get taxed, how that money is going to be spent. Okay, and as time goes on, it's not a big issue at the beginning, but as time goes on throughout the 1700s, that tends to be a really problematic thing. It's kind of like in our country, like tax season just happened, right? Confessional story. My wife, I just did our taxes like 2 nights ago. And God bless my wife, she actually is the one that enters in all the data on TurboTax. Like, that's her thing. And I say, cool, babe. You go on with that stuff. We're going to enter that in. And then she leaves it up to me to pay it. Oh my gosh, we owed $3,800 in federal taxes this year. In addition to the taxes we already paid on our paycheck. And I'm thinking, oh, it makes me so mad because, let me be honest. I love our country, okay? I'm an American by and by, but geez, seriously? $3,800? And what's the government going to do with it? The government's all the way in Washington, D.C., 3,000 miles away. Are they going to spend it the way I want to have it spent? And the answer is no. We have an $18.2 trillion debt, which is both parties' fault, I guess. It kind of just depends. I'm not political here. I'm just saying that's a fact. So, I mean, I can understand in some ways how the colonists would feel, knowing that if they do pay taxes, and they will, that money is like far removed from them. Can you see that? How that's frustrating? And they don't even get to choose who they're going to elect at all to represent them. You know who chooses to spend the money? It's the members of parliament. Who decides who the members of parliament are? White males in England, not these guys. These guys get some local control, but the parliament has all the power. So that's something to remember. As we go on. So with all that being said, it's a dual identity. We don't really have an identity crisis in the early 1700s, but I think it's worth talking about is that we have an area of the world here, the colonies that are distinctly have their foot in both areas. They're British colonists, mostly, yet they're Americans. And they're creating their own American kind of culture, right? And that's just what happens over time, the less, and with the distance that exists between the mother country and the colonies. It's just natural, that's what happens. But yet it's a very diverse group of colonies too, right? Got all kinds of people, but all of that is to say, we have America, big idea, becoming more and more its own rather than Great Britain's baby. They're growing up, so to speak. Just like my kids are going to grow up, and it's like sometimes I dream, and I have these weird dreams that keep me. I got a dream that my 8-year-old, grew up, and he's as old as like one of you. I don't know how many of you guys are like 21. I just had this vision, and I woke up in a nightmare. I was like, oh God, he's not 21 yet, is he? That's scary. It's going to be big, and I can't hold him anymore. And not that I want to now, but it's kind of like, geez, that's what's essentially happening here. And I'm going off on a tangent here, but in some ways, it's kind of interesting. The American Revolution probably you wouldn't have had to have a revolution with war anyways, in some ways, because the Americans would feel that it's just necessary to sever the bonds between them and the English. That's what Canada did without a war, and that's why they're a country. But that happens like in 1865. So anyways. All right, let's get to chapter 6, the making of an American Revolution. We're going to get into why this all happens. Okay, so we've got these distinct American colonies. They're British, they're colonial too. There's got to be something that pushes us into this revolutionary stage. And it's got to do with money. But more importantly, it has to do with some other things. Anyways, let's just kind of go over some of the objectives tonight with this chapter. And one of the big things I want you to get from tonight is about the 7 Years' War. Okay, the 7 Years' War is a war between France and England, and it's fought worldwide. And it's not just in the colonies, it's worldwide. How does this war catapult us into this dangerous state we have called a revolution? Okay, by the late 1700s. Because before this, everything's pretty good. Everything's pretty good. It's not perfect. It's still pretty good. Also, a lot of stuff, but we'll talk about all these acts. You'll learn why the American colonists took offense to the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and other acts taken by the British government during the 1760s. In short, if you read the chapter, what are all these acts supposed to do? Get money back, because the 7 Years' War basically cost a lot of money, and they're asking the Americans to pay up. Like, you can't have us defend you and just not pay anything for it, you know? You can't live under our roof and not pay rent, you know? It's like you're 18 now, you're either put up or shut up. Whatever. Okay, that was a bad example.
Actually, that was pretty good.
That was a pretty good example.
Oh my God.
Well, you know what, Denise? I'm all about good examples. Feel me? All right, number 3. You'll learn what the colonial responses were to also another series of acts called the Townsend Duties. These are all the same idea. We've got a war. We've got to pay for it. We've got all these acts. We're going to look heavily at the Stamp Act tonight, because it's really easy to say this was a big deal to the colonists, but most people don't really understand why it was such a big deal. We'll also look at the Townsend Duties. These are more taxes placed on the colonists. Taxes, 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 acts, acts, acts. Like what the government did to me this year. I mean, geez-o. What's up with that? Tensions, escalation of tensions after 1772. And you know what's funny about all of this? And honestly, before 1760, before the 7 Years' War, again, it just takes a little bit of time to make relationships bad, huh? You know? And that's basically the big idea tonight. So I'm going to go really in depth on this part. We're going to go in depth on this part, and then get into this part. I have a really cool way, hopefully, to do that. Anyways, let's start out with the first one, the 7 Years' War. So, okay, that's a dumb question too. Like, how long was the 7 Years' War? Or when was the War of 1812? That's always a good one. Who was buried in Grant's tomb? Whatever. Okay. Just to wet your whistle a little bit, this is the Stamp Act. What we're going to do later on is we're going to spend some time getting into that and why that was such a big problem and big deal. But anyways, that's just a picture from Instagram back in the day. All right, let's start off here. North America in 1760. So all is pretty good. I'm sorry, 1750. All is pretty good in the colonies here, generally. But there is one area that we got to look at, and that is disputed territories. And by the way, if you look at this map, it's like, oh my goodness gracious, look how much land France has. I mean, Jesus. You got all this stuff. I bet they don't even have anybody populating these areas. Like, they have some forts that they put up all over the place, like the city of Detroit is a fort. It's a French word. They used to call it Detroit. You're like, okay, cool. I didn't need to know that, Mr. Birch. But anyways, disputed lands. And that's where the problem is going to start to happen. So, and it all starts in the mid 1750s. Now, kind of what started to happen is the American colonists have started to kind of get more established here in the 1700s, and they've also started to move out into these areas. And they started to claim these areas. Problem is, the French are there, and the Native Americans are there. Okay? Now, one constant in this class throughout the first, at least half of the course, is to understand the relationship of Native Americans to the powers that be. Okay? What's the role of the Native Americans? Do the Native Americans like the French better, or do they like the English better? Pick your poison. At first, they like the French better, because the French trade with them. As I said before, the French have built a ton of forts where they basically trade fur. And the Native Americans are getting new technologies and stuff. And they're down with the French. They like the French. The people that the Native Americans really don't like is the American colonists, because the American colonists are starting to just claim this land and acting like, that's my land, not your land, right? So get out. And that's what starts to happen. And in 1754, we have the first clash in the Ohio country. And, oops, sorry. The Ohio country is roughly where the state of Ohio is, I guess, more or less. But basically, American colonists are coming in there. You've got them building some forts. Problem is that the French, as you can see, are in the blue here, and they feel that they've already got these areas. And so Ohio's fairly next to Virginia, so what happens is this is our first appearance of George Washington. The government of Virginia sends George Washington in to basically try to defend these forts, and the French are sending in troops as well. And not only that, the French are basically enlisting the help of Native American tribes around the area to defend the forts. That's why the 7 Years' War is often called the French and Indian War, because of the fact that the French have alliances with the Native Americans. Well, to be honest with you, there is no decisive victor. However, what does start to happen for the next 7 years is this battle in the Ohio country escalates into battles throughout not only the rest of North America, but also the world too, between France and Britain. France and Britain are kind of, by the way, old enemies. France and Britain have been fighting wars with each other ever since, like, the end of the Roman Empire, basically, over territories in Europe, and now they're just doing the same thing here. So, all that is to say, and I want to make a long story short because I don't want to go in depth on the 7 Years' War, but I think it's important for you to understand what the ultimate outcomes are. The consequences are a couple of different things. Number one, you have what's called the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Now notice that this war, it's supposed to be 7 years. You would think it would end in 1762. It goes all the way through 1762, and like right at the beginning of 1763, they signed this treaty. And basically, the Treaty of Paris after